Hello students, in today's video we are going to study different types of epithelial tissue, their structure, location and functions. Now as we all know, a group of similar cells form a tissue. Now these cells, they work together to perform a specialized function. So every tissue type has its own special functions. Now there are four main types of animal tissues or human tissues, as human beings are also animals. And these tissues are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Now one of the most important function of epithelial tissue is the protection. Like for example, outer layer of the skin, epidermis. Epidermis is an epithelial tissue and it protects our body from injuries, from pollutants, that is chemicals, microorganisms. So the main function of this epidermis is protection. Other functions of epithelial tissue include functions like absorption, secretion, filtration, transportation of nutrients, exchange of gases, etc. Then connective tissue, it connects. For example, ligament. Ligament is a connective tissue. It connects one bone to other bone. Then muscle tissue. For example, skeletal muscles. They are very necessary for the movement of body. Then nervous tissue or the nerve tissue. It is essential for the control and coordination of each organ of the body, organ system and thus the entire body. So in this video, we are going to study epithelial tissue. Now let's understand few important features of epithelial tissue. Now epithelial tissue covers internal body surfaces. Like for example, it forms the lining of abdominal cavity. Then it covers external body surfaces like the epidermis. Epidermis is an epithelial tissue and it forms covering of the skin. Then it lines hollow organs like for example endocardium. Endocardium is an epithelial tissue and endocardium forms inner lining of the chambers of the heart. Then it lines the cavities like the let's say the pleural cavity. Then it also forms inner lining of the tubes like the respiratory tubes, the gastrointestinal tubes which are communicating with the external environment. And epithelial tissue is also responsible for the formation of glands. So epithelial tissue, main function of epithelial tissue is to cover internal and external body surfaces. Now another very important characteristic feature of epithelial tissue is this, that epithelial tissue consists of tightly packed cells so that it looks like a sheet of cells. Epithelial tissue looks like a sheet of cells and these cells, they remain anchored or they remain attached to an underlying tissue which is known as the basement membrane. Now let's classify epithelial tissue. Now epithelial tissue is broadly classified as surface epithelial tissue and glandular epithelial tissue. Now surface epithelial tissue basically forms the linings of internal and external body surfaces, linings of hollow organs, cavities, tubes, while the glandular epithelial tissue forms the glands. Now, surface epithelial tissue is of two types, simple epithelial tissue and compound epithelial tissue. Now, simple epithelial tissue is made up of single layer of cells and this layer of cells remains attached to the basement membrane. Now, simple epithelial tissue is of three types. Simple squamous, then simple cuboidal, then simple columnar. Now besides these three simple epithelial tissues, another tissue is a pseudo-stratified tissue. It is a modified simple epithelial tissue. Now pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue is actually made up of single layer of cells, but it appears as if it is made up of two layers of cells, and therefore it is a modification of simple epithelial tissue, and it is known as pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Now, this pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue can be ciliated or it can be non-ciliated. Now, primary function of simple epithelial tissue is to act as a barrier, or it is also involved in secretion, then absorption, exchange of gases, transportation of nutrients, etc. Then comes the compound epithelial tissue. Now, in compound epithelial tissue, cells are arranged in multiple layers or stratas. Thus, this compound epithelial tissue is also known as stratified epithelial tissue. Now, only the lower layer of cells is in contact with the basement membrane. Then, transitional epithelial tissue is a modification of stratified epithelial tissue. Now, stratified epithelial tissue is further classified in three types based upon the shape of surface epithelial cells. If the surface epithelial cells are flattened, it is known as stratified squamous. If the surface epithelial cells are cube shaped, it is known as stratified cuboidal. And if the surface epithelial cells are columnar, then it is known as stratified columnar. Now, stratified squamous tissue is again of two types. It can be keratinized or it can be non-keratinized. Now, the basic or the primary function of stratified epithelial tissue is to provide protection to the underlying tissues. So, this is the classification of surface epithelial tissue that covers internal and external body surfaces. Now, glandular epithelial tissue forms the glands. Now, these glands can be unicellular, where a single isolated cell forms a gland, or they can be multicellular, where a cluster of cells form a gland. Now, multicellular glands are of two types, endocrine glands and exocrine glands. So, this is the classification of epithelial tissue. Now, let's study structure, location and functions of each type of these epithelial tissues. Now, simple epithelial tissue is composed of single layer of cells. Now, it is classified as simple squamous, then simple cuboidal, simple columnar based on the shapes of the cells. Now, simple squamous epithelium is composed of single layer of wide flattened cells. Now, these cells appear as thin flat tiles, or they appear as paving stone spread on a surface, and all these cells are very closely packed. Thus, simple squamous epithelium is also known as the pavement epithelium. And since the cells are flattened, they possess horizontally flattened, nearly oval shaped nuclei. And as you can see, every cell is in contact with the basement membrane. Now, the location of the simple squamous epithelium. Now, in heart, it forms a lining which is known as endocardium. Now, look in this diagram. This is a rough diagram of the heart. Heart, we know, is a hollow muscular organ, and the four chambers of the heart, they are filled with the blood, and the wall of the heart is made up of cardiac muscles. Now, endocardium, which is shown here in the black color, a lining shown in the black color. So, this endocardium, it forms the lining of the chambers of the heart. So, here endocardium forms a barrier between the blood and the outer cardiac muscles. So, one of the functions of squamous epithelium is to form the barrier. Similarly, it forms the inner lining of the walls of the blood vessel. So let's assume this is a blood vessel and its inner lining is made up of epithelial tissues. Now here this lining is known as endothelium. Now nutrients like glucose and gases like for example oxygen is transported from the blood to the epithelial tissue, and then the epithelial tissue transport these nutrients and oxygen to the underlying tissues. So another function of squamous epithelium is the exchange of gases and transcellular transport of nutrients. Then it also forms lining of the alveoli. Alveoli, as we know, are the air sacs in the lungs. And here the epithelial tissue, the lining, it mediates the exchange of gases between the alveoli and the adjacent blood capillaries. So the function of here also the function of simple squamous epithelium is the exchange of gases. Now besides this, the simple squamous epithelium, it forms the lining of the Bowman's capsule. Now this is the structure of nephron. Nephron is found in the kidneys, and this is a network of blood capillaries known as the glomerulus. And here is the cup-shaped Bowman's capsule. Now as you can see here, the Bowman's capsule is lined with the epithelium. Now this epithelium is the simple squamous epithelium. Now this simple squamous epithelium in the Bowman's capsule acts like a sieve, and it filters the blood in the glomerulus. The filtrate comes out in the lumen of the nephron. So here the function of simple squamous epithelium is the filtration. So the functions of simple squamous epithelium is to act like a barrier. Then it mediates exchange of gases. It is responsible for the transcellular transport of nutrients, and it is also involved in the process of mediating filtration. Now second type of simple epithelial tissue is the simple cuboidal. Here cells are cube shaped. They possess almost same height, width and depth. Nuclei are large, spherical, and are present in the center of the cell. Now, simple cuboidal epithelium also forms the lining. For example, it forms the lining of the kidney tubules. Now, look at this structure. This structure is of nephron. Now, this part of the nephron is the kidney tubule. It is a tube-like structure. It is a kidney tubule, and it is lined by an epithelium. The epithelium here is the cuboidal epithelium. Now, this tubule is surrounded by the blood capillaries. Now, blood is filtered. The filtrate passes in the lumen. Now, water, ions, glucose, and many other substances are absorbed from the filtrate into these epithelial cells, and then those substances, they move from the epithelial cells to the blood in the capillaries. So the simple cuboidal epithelium is involved in the process of absorption. Similarly, many drugs in the blood of these capillaries, those drugs, they pass into the epithelial cells, and from the epithelial cells, those drugs, they are secreted in the filtrate. So simple cuboidal epithelium is involved in the process of secretion and absorption. Then another example, germinal epithelium of ovaries and seminiferous tubules are also cuboidal. That epithelium is also cuboidal epithelium. Now here the cuboidal epithelium secretes ova and sperms. Then third type of simple epithelial tissue is the simple columnar epithelial tissue. As you can see in this figure, the cells are elongated and they are column shaped. Nuclei are also elongated and they are located towards the base of each cell. Now, column cells also form the lining. For example, they form the lining of stomach. They form the lining of intestine. They form the lining of entire gastrointestinal tract. Now, in stomach, these simple columnar epithelial cells, they secrete mucus. They also secrete prostaglandins. So, their function is mucus. Now, columnar cells with surface structures like microvilli and cilia are also commonly found in the body. Now, these microvilli, they increase the surface area of the columnar cells. So, these cells with microvilli, they are found in the small intestine, where they are involved in the absorption of nutrients. Then cilia are hair-like structures. These are hair-like projections that move the substances. So, simple simple columnar epithelial cells, they are found in the trachea, where they push the mucus towards the throat. And these are also found in the uterine tubes, where they push or propel the ova towards the uterus. So, the functions of simple columnar epithelial cells is secretion, absorption. Then ciliated columnar cells, they are involved in the movement of substances, like they push the mucus towards the throat so that the mucus could be expelled from the throat. Then they propel over towards the uterus. So, these are the main three types of simple epithelial tissue, simple surface epithelial tissue. Now let's discuss modified simple epithelial tissue. Now this is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Now pseudo, as we know, means false. So this tissue falsely look like stratified epithelial tissue, but actually this is a simple epithelial tissue. Now look at this figure. This epithelial tissue is made up of cells, and the cells are of different heights. There are long cells and then there are short cells. Long cells and short cells. So actually there is a single layer of cells, and all the cells are attached to the basement membrane, but cells are of different heights. So their nuclei are also at different heights. So the tissue appears as if it is made up of two layers, as if it is stratified, but actually it is made up of single layer of cells, and it is a simple epithelial tissue. And since it looks like stratified, this tissue is known as pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial tissue or pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Now this pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, it can be ciliated or it can be non-ciliated. Now we know the function of cilia is to move substances. Now ciliated pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, it forms inner lining of trachea and bronchi, that is the respiratory tract. Now we know that mucus in the respiratory tract traps dust particles, pollutants, microbes and other foreign substances. So ciliated pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial cells in the respiratory tract, they move the mucus towards the throat, so that the mucus could be expelled out, and thus this tissue, it protects the respiratory tract. Now, non-ciliated pseudo-stratified epithelium is found in the epididymis. It is found in the vas deferens of male reproductive system, and here the cells secrete mucus and help in the movement of sperms. So, this is about pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Now let's study stratified epithelial tissue. Now unlike the simple epithelial tissue that consists of single layer of cells, stratified epithelial tissue is composed of multiple layer of cells. Now where the lower layer of the cells is in contact with the basement membrane, and the main function of stratified epithelial tissue is the protection. It protects the underlying structures. That means it protects the tissues, the structures which are present below this below the surface of epithelial tissue. Now these are classified as stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar based upon the shape of cells in the uppermost surface layer. So the first type of stratified epithelium is the stratified squamous. Now, as you can see here in the figure, surface cells are flattened and are squamous cells. Now, the main function is protection. So, the main function here is to form a protective surface layer. It protects the areas that are subjected to stress and injuries. It forms lining of those surface areas that bear or that withstand mechanical or chemical stress. Now, in addition to this, another very important thing to understand is this, that cell in the basal layer, they divide continuously, and these cells, they divide and they move towards the upper surface layer, and they replace the older cells, as the older cells are subjected to mechanical and chemical stress. So this tissue, it regenerates very fast. Now, stratified squamous epithelium can be keratinized or it can be non-keratinized. Now, in keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue, the cells of upper surface layer are dead. They have no nucleus, they have no cytoplasm. Instead, these cells, they get filled with keratin. Now, keratin is a fibrous, tough protein, and it provides protection against abrasions, cuts, injuries, and it also prevents the loss of water. And thus, this keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is found on the dry surfaces. It forms the upper layer of the skin, hair, and nails. It withstands or it bears all types of mechanical and chemical stress, and thereby it protects the tissues which are present below the let's say below the skin. Now, in addition to this, this tissue is impermeable to water. That means water can neither go inside or come outside this membrane. So, it prevents the drying of all underneath tissues. Now, non-keratinized tissue, in the non-keratinized tissue, cells of the surface layer, they are live. There is no keratin, and this surface layer is also permeable to water. Water can go inside and water can come outside. So, it is found, this non-keratinized tissue is found on the moist surfaces. Like it forms the lining of buccal cavity, it covers the cornea of eye, it forms the inner lining of esophagus. Here also, the main purpose is the protection. It protects these organs from any type of mechanical stress or also the chemical stress, like esophagus. The food passes. Esophagus is a food tube. The food passes through this esophagus. So, this lining, innermost lining, it protects the underneath tissues from chemical and mechanical stress. Now, after stratified squamous, second type of stratified epithelial tissue is the stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now, here the upper surface layer cells are cuboidal in shape. Now, this tissue is usually not very common, and it is found lining, it forms the lining of the ducts of the glands. Like for example, it forms the lining of the ducts of salivary glands, sweat gland, and the basic purpose of this tissue is protection. It provides protection, and it also protects these ducts from any type of mechanical and chemical stress. Now, third type of stratified epithelial tissue is the stratified columnar epithelium. So, here the cells in the upper layer, they are columnar in shape. Now, like stratified cuboidal, these stratified columnar epithelial tissue is also not very common. It forms the conjunctival epithelium, and here also its main function is to provide protection. So, this is about the stratified epithelial tissue. Now, let's study transitional epithelium. It is exclusively found lining the organs of urinary system, and therefore it is also known as urolithium. It is a modified stratified epithelial tissue. It is exclusively found lining the inner walls of urinary bladder, ureters and urethra, and it allows stretching of the walls. Now, as the urine fills, it allows stretching of the walls of urinary bladder. Now, look at these figures. It is known as transitional epithelium as it undergoes change in the appearance depending upon the state of urinary bladder. Now, when the urinary bladder is relaxed, the cells appear stratified cuboidal. Now, when the urine fills the urinary bladder and its wall stretch, the epithelium appears as if it is a stratified squamous. So, transitional epithelium undergoes change in the appearance as its main function is to allow stretching of the tissues. So, this covers surface epithelium, this covers simple and stratified epithelial tissue and their modification. Now, let's study glandular epithelial tissue. Now, glandular epithelial tissue forms the glands. Now, look at this figure. This is the surface epithelial tissue. Now, as you can see here, this gland is formed from the infolding of the surface epithelial tissue. So, gland is formed from the infolding of surface epithelial tissue. Now, these glands are of two types. They can be unicellular or they can be multicellular. Now, when one cell forms a gland, it is known as a unicellular gland. So, unicellular glands consist of isolated glandular cells. For example, a goblet cell. Now, look at this figure. This is a single epithelial cell, and this epithelial cells forms a goblet cell. Now, goblet cell is a unicellular gland, a gland which is made up of one single cell. Now, as you can see here, this goblet cell consists of secretory vesicles and it secretes mucus. Now, multicellular glands are made up of clusters of cells. As already discussed, these are formed by the infolding of surface epithelium. Now, these glands can be exocrine glands or the endocrine glands. Now, as you can see here in this exocrine gland, this is the duct. So, let's say the exocrine gland is a sebaceous gland that secretes the oil. So, the oil is released by the gland and it reaches the duct, and from the duct it moves to the surface. So, the gland remains in contact with the surface epithelial cells. While endocrine glands are formed from the infoldings of surface epithelium, but as they mature, they lose contact with the surface epithelium and they release their secretions in the blood. Examples of endocrine glands are, for example, pancreas, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, ovaries, testes, etc. So, this covers the epithelial tissue. This covers the this covers the surface epithelial tissue and the glandular epithelial tissues and their modifications. If you find the information useful, kindly like, subscribe and share this video. Thanks for watching this video.